Now I have everything I need. Let me write the new story. The call came at 11:47 on a Thursday night. I know the exact time because I had just looked at the clock on the nightstand, the same small brass clock my wife Eleanor had kept on her side of the bed for 30 years. I had moved it to my side after she passed. I looked at it before I reached for the phone, and the numbers read 11:47, and my whole life was still ordinary. Then I answered, "Dad." My son's voice was strained, tight, the voice of a man swallowing pain. I had a fall. Pretty bad. They brought me to St. Joseph's. I was already sitting up. "What happened? Where are you hurt?" "My back," he said. "My lower back. And my left leg. Dad, I can't feel my toes." I was dressed and out the door in 7 minutes. I drove the 40 miles to Springfield in 35, which I am not proud of, but I would do again without hesitation. My son was lying in an emergency bay at St. Joseph's Medical Center, his face pale, his jaw tight, his eyes searching for mine when I pushed through the curtain. "Dad," he exhaled, "you came." "Where else would I go?" I told him. His name is Marcus. He is 38 years old. He works construction, has for 15 years, and I have spent 15 years telling him to be careful on those scaffolds. He has always told me he is the safest man on any job site. He told me that the night before he fell, too, at dinner, when we sat across from each other over my kitchen table eating the pot roast I had made, the same recipe Eleanor used for 30 years. His wife sat beside him at dinner. I will call her my daughter-in-law because that is what she is, though lately the word sits differently in my mouth, heavier somehow. She had smiled at me over the pot roast and said, "Dad, this is just like Eleanor used to make." I had taken that as a kindness. I understand now it was not. The doctors said Marcus had sustained a compression injury to his lumbar spine. L4 and L5 were the words they used. They talked about nerve involvement, about sensation loss, about cautious optimism, but serious concern. They admitted him that same night. I sat in the chair beside his bed until the sky outside went from black to gray and gray to the flat white light of a November morning in Illinois. His daughter-in-law came in at 8 with coffee and paper cups. She handed me one and asked if I had slept. I said not much. She patted my arm and said he was lucky to have such a devoted father. I believed her then. I write that now and feel ashamed of how easily I believed her then. My name is Robert Callahan. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a postal carrier in Decatur, before my knees required a transfer to a sorting role, and then eventually to retirement. Eleanor and I bought our house on Maple Grove Drive in 1988. We raised Marcus there. We painted every room ourselves. We put in the garden together the spring after Eleanor was diagnosed, because she said she wanted to see it bloom one more time. And she did. Twice more before she was gone. I kept the garden after. I am not a sentimental man by nature, but that garden is Eleanor, and I keep it the way you keep something you are not willing to lose. Marcus knew what that garden meant. The whole property meant something. 4 acres. The house Eleanor and I built together, the detached workshop where I still go on winter mornings to build things with my hands. It is appraised now at $620,000. I did not know, at the beginning of that week at St. Joseph's, that my son had been calculating that number for months. The days blurred. Day 1, the specialist evaluations. Day 2, the pain management consultations, the talk of long-term rehabilitation, the warnings about permanent nerve damage. Day 3, the physical therapy team came in and began gentle assessments. Marcus winced with every movement. He gripped the bed rail. He asked the therapist to stop twice, and she did, professionally, patiently. I watched from my chair and felt the particular grief of a parent watching a child suffer, which does not stop when the child becomes an adult. It only becomes more complicated. The physical therapist's name was Andrea. She was perhaps 35, methodical and precise in her movements, with the kind of steady competence you notice in people who are genuinely good at their jobs. She checked on Marcus 3 times a day. Each time she finished a session, she would make notes on her tablet and leave with a brief, professional nod to me. We had not exchanged more than a dozen words. On the 4th evening, I stepped out of the room to stretch my legs. The corridor was quiet, the dinner hour already past, most family visitors filtering out. I walked to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the parking lot below, at the orange glow of the sodium lights over rows of cars. I was thinking about nothing in particular, or trying to, the way you do when you cannot afford to think too clearly. I heard footsteps behind me. Andrea had followed me to the window. She looked down the corridor both ways, a small, deliberate check I would not have noticed, except that everything about her manner had changed. She was no longer the methodical therapist. She was someone who had made a decision and was still deciding if it was the right one. She held out a folded square of paper. Her voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry," she said. "I debated this all day. But if it were my father, I would want to know." She pressed the paper into my hand and walked back toward the nursing station without looking back. I held it for a long moment without opening it. The corridor was empty now. Through the window, a car pulled slowly through the lot below, headlights sweeping across the pavement. I unfolded the paper. 4 lines. Neat, careful handwriting. He walked to the vending area last night at midnight. No assistance, no pain indicators. Check the Hall B camera from 11:58 p.m. I'm sorry. I read it 3 times. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. I stood at the window for another minute, watching that same car circle the lot as if it could not decide where to go. Then I walked back to room 318 and sat down beside my son. He was asleep, or appeared to be, his breathing slow and even, one hand loose at his side. The monitors beside him beeped in their patient rhythm. I looked at his face, which is my face in some ways, the same jaw, the same brow, the marks of the same blood. I thought about the note in my pocket. I thought about the word sorry, written twice, once spoken aloud. I thought about why a physical therapist who had no reason to be involved in my life had chosen to become involved. I did not sleep that night either, but I was not grieving anymore. I was waiting. I called a man named Gerald the next morning from the hospital parking garage, the one place I was certain Marcus could not hear me. Gerald had been a supervisor in the county administration office for 20 years before he retired. We had served together on the church deacon board for nearly a decade. He was the kind of man who knew people, and more importantly, who people trusted. "Gerald," I said when he answered, "I need to ask you something that I am not ready to ask out loud yet." He said, "Then ask it quietly." I told him about the note. I told him about the note without telling him what I suspected, only what it said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know someone who handles hospital security contracts. I can have you connected within the hour. No paperwork, no official request, just a look." "Thank you," I said. 40 minutes later, a number I did not recognize called me back. A woman with a flat, efficient voice asked me for the camera designation and the timestamp. I gave her what Andrea had written. She said she would call me within 2 hours. I went back upstairs. My daughter-in-law had arrived. She was sitting in the chair I had vacated, holding Marcus's hand across the blanket, and she looked up when I came in with the warm, practiced expression she had been giving me all week. "Dad, you look exhausted. Can we convince you to go home tonight?" I smiled. "I am fine," I told her. "I do not want to leave him." She squeezed my hand with her free one. "You are such a good father," she said. I sat across the room and watched them both for a while. There is a particular quality to waiting when you know something is coming. The room looked the same monitors, the same curtained window, the same smell of antiseptic and recycled air. But everything in it was different because I was different. My phone buzzed while Marcus was being seen by the attending physician that afternoon, and my daughter-in-law had stepped out to make calls. I took it into the hallway. The woman with the efficient voice said, "I'm sending you a link. The file will expire in 24 hours. You didn't get it from me." I sat in the family waiting area at the end of the hall, an empty room at that hour, with plastic chairs and a wall-mounted television playing a cooking program with the sound off. I opened the link. The footage was grainy, as these things always are, a ceiling angle view of the corridor connecting the patient wing to the rehabilitation suite. The timestamp in the corner read 11:57 p.m. The hallway was empty, lit by the dim blue-white of overnight lighting. At 11:58, a door opened. Room 318, my son's room. Marcus stepped into the hallway. He walked with no hesitation, no stiffness, no reaching for walls. He walked the way a healthy 38-year-old man walks, with the particular loose ease of a person whose body does not hurt. He wore his hospital gown and the grip socks the nurses had given him. He turned right, toward the vending alcove. His stride was even and confident. He reached the alcove, fed coins into the machine, collected something from the slot. He stood there for a moment, reading the wrapper. Then he walked back, same stride, same ease. He pushed open the door to room 318 and disappeared. The whole sequence took 4 minutes and 22 seconds. I sat in that plastic chair for a long time. The cooking program played silently on the wall. Someone on screen was folding dough with great care, pressing it thin with a rolling pin, turning it, pressing again. I watched it without seeing it. My son walked into that hospital in 4 minutes and 22 seconds. I mean, the version of my son I had known for 38 years. The boy I taught to ride a bike on the driveway of the house on Maple Grove, who cried on my shoulder at Eleanor's funeral, who called me every Sunday without fail since the day he moved out. That son walked into that hallway, and I watched him. And he was fine, and I was left alone in a plastic chair with a grief I did not have a name for yet. I drove home that night. I told them I needed fresh clothes and a real night's sleep. My daughter-in-law said, of course, that was sensible, that she would stay with Marcus. She smiled, her practice smile. Marcus said, "Thanks, Dad. You need the rest." I drove home. The house was dark and quiet when I unlocked the front door. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the pot roast from the week before. Eleanor's clock on the nightstand read 9:14 when I sat on the edge of the bed. I sat there for a while in the dark. Then I got up, went to the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I started with the insurance claim Marcus had filed with his employer's carrier 3 days into his hospitalization. I had helped him fill out sections of it, because he said his hands were too unsteady from the pain medication. I had felt useful doing it. I had felt like a good father. The claim cited total temporary disability, potential permanent nerve damage, and carried a projected settlement value the adjuster had mentioned to Marcus's wife in a phone call I had been present for, a figure north of $200,000. Then I started looking at other things. I am not a suspicious man by habit, but I am methodical. 31 years of sorting and delivering mail teaches you to be methodical. You look at what is in front of you without expectation, and you account for what you find. What I found, working through what I could access and asking Gerald to help me access the rest over the following 2 days, was a shape. Not proof of everything, not yet, but a shape. Marcus owed money, more money than I had known. A second mortgage on his house taken out 18 months ago, credit lines extended and then overdrawn. A business investment with a college friend that had gone badly and quietly. The kind of thing you do not mention to your father because you know what your father will say. The total, when Gerald helped me add it together, was somewhere near $280,000. The workers' compensation claim, if it settled at the projected figure, would cover most of that. And then there was the other conversation, the one I had not fully processed until I sat at that kitchen table in the dark. My daughter-in-law, 3 days into the hospitalization, asking me gently over terrible hospital coffee whether I had thought about what would happen if Marcus needed long-term care. Whether I had considered that he might not be able to work for years, possibly ever. Whether I had thought about what that would mean financially. I had said I would help in whatever way I could. She had said, "Your property is worth quite a lot, isn't it?" Not quite a question. I had said yes. We thought about refinancing once, but Eleanor never wanted to. She had said, Of course, I understand." Then, after a pause that I had not read correctly at the time, I was just thinking, if things got really difficult, there are always options. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the shape of it. The debt, the fraudulent injury, the insurance settlement, and if that was not enough, a father with a property worth more than $600,000 who had just told them he would help in any way he could. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about what she would say and what she would do. Eleanor was a gentler person than I am in most ways, but she was not a person who allowed things to be taken from her, not things that mattered. I went to bed. I did not sleep much. In the morning I drove back to Springfield. I spent 3 more days at the hospital. I smiled at the right times. I brought coffee. I held my son's hand when the doctor came in with his careful, neutral assessment. I watched my daughter-in-law press Marcus's arm, and I watched them exchange the small glances that people exchange when they share a secret and believe no one else can read them. I nodded when the doctor said they were considering inpatient rehabilitation. I said, whatever it takes. On the third day, Gerald came. I had asked him to come, and he came without question, the way he had done everything in this situation. Quietly, and without asking for explanations, I was not ready to give. I had also called my attorney, a woman named Frances, who had handled Eleanor's estate and who I trusted completely. She had said, whatever you need, Robert. Tell me what you are trying to do. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll be there. And I had called Andrea. I had waited until I saw her in the corridor alone, and I had simply said, thank you. She had looked at me with the same careful expression she had worn when she handed me the note, a person measuring how much of the truth they have taken responsibility for. I told her I was going to need her to tell someone else what she told me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. The room was more full than usual that morning. Gerald sat near the window. Frances was in the corridor outside. Andrea was at the nursing station down the hall. My daughter-in-law had arrived early and was arranging the small collection of things on the bedside table, a practiced busyness that I recognized now for what it was. Marcus said, You look like you slept better. His voice was warm and almost convincing. I said, I did. And then I said, I want to talk to both of you about the house. My daughter-in-law set down what she was holding. Her attention sharpened in a way she did not quite manage to conceal. I continued, I have been thinking about what you said earlier in the week, about options. I understand what you were suggesting, and I have been considering it seriously. Marcus shifted in the bed. He was watching my face. He said, Dad, we don't want to put you in a difficult position. I know, I said. I know you don't. And then I placed my phone on the rolling tray between us, screen up, the video already loaded, timestamp reading 11:57 p.m. I pressed play. The room went very quiet. The monitors continued their patient beeping. On the small screen, the hallway outside room 318 was dim and empty. Then the door opened and Marcus walked out with the easy, unhurried stride of a man in no pain at all. I watched my son watch himself. I watched his face move through the sequence that faces move through in these moments. First confusion, which was not real. Then the beginning of an explanation, which did not come. Then the stillness that comes after. My daughter-in-law said, Where did you get that? Her voice was tight. I said, It does not matter where I got it. Frances stepped into the room from the corridor. She introduced herself by name and said she was my attorney. She said she had also been in contact with the workers' compensation insurance carrier that morning, and with Marcus's employer. She said she had shared the footage. Gerald did not say anything. He sat near the window and watched. Marcus said, Dad. He said it the way you say a word when you are trying to find the sentence that comes after it, and there is no sentence. I waited. He said, I did not know how to ask you for help. I said, You could have said, Marcus, I am in serious financial trouble and I need help. That is how you ask for help. That is all you had to say. He was quiet. I said, I sat in that chair for 11 days. I held your hand. I watched you wince and I believed you. You looked at your father and you made a decision that he was someone you could use. I need you to understand what that is. Not what it costs you. What it is. There is a particular silence that comes after that kind of sentence. Not emptiness, but weight. The room was full of it. My daughter-in-law began to cry. I do not know how much of it was real. I did not ask. Marcus said, I am sorry. And then again, quieter. I am sorry, Dad. I looked at him for a long time. My son, my boy who I had watched learn to walk and fall down and get up on that same driveway 30-some years ago. I thought about Eleanor watching from the front porch, calling out encouragement in her particular voice. I thought about the clock on my nightstand that used to be on her side. I said, The insurance claim has been suspended pending an investigation. Your employer has been notified. I am not going to stop that process. I want you to understand that clearly. His jaw tightened. He nodded. I said, I love you. I have loved you since before you were born. That does not change. But I will not be used. Not by anyone, and not by you. I stood up. Gerald stood with me. Frances was already making her way into the corridor. I paused at the door and turned back one last time. I said, When you are ready to have an honest conversation, call me. Not before. I walked out of room 318 and down the corridor to the elevator. Gerald was beside me. Neither of us spoke until we were outside in the parking lot, under the gray Illinois November sky, the cold air immediate and clean after the recycled warmth of the hospital. Gerald said, "You did that well." I said, "I do not feel like I did anything well." He said, "No, but you did it right." The drive home took 40 minutes. I kept the radio off. I thought about nothing for most of it, or tried to, which is a different thing from actual peace, but is what is available in the immediate aftermath of a thing like this. The house on Maple Grove was exactly as I had left it. The workshop out back, the winter garden, bare but tended, Eleanor's clock on the nightstand, everything where I had put it. I stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on lights. Through the back window I could see the garden, colorless in the late afternoon gray. Eleanor had planted 3 kinds of roses there, one for each decade she said she planned to grow old in this house. She did not get all 3 decades. But the bushes were still there, and I kept them. My neighbor Harold knocked on the back door around 5 with a covered plate. He said his wife had made extra and thought I might not have eaten. I thanked him and meant it. I sat at the kitchen table with the plate, and Harold sat across from me, and we talked about ordinary things, his grandchildren, the ice storm the forecasters were calling for, whether the hardware store on Main was really closing. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that makes no mark on the world and is somehow exactly what is needed. My phone showed 2 missed calls from Marcus's number by the time Harold left. I set it face down on the counter. December came slowly that year. The investigation moved the way these things move, with the particular glacial patience of institutions protecting themselves. The workers' compensation claim was denied. I had a brief, formal conversation with Frances about what the exposure might be. She was measured and direct, and I appreciated that about her. I asked what I needed to do, and she told me, and I did it. My daughter-in-law's name did not appear in the formal proceedings, which was a legal matter I did not fully understand and chose not to press. She and Marcus separated in January. I learned this from Marcus himself, in the first real conversation we had, in February, at a diner on the edge of Decatur, over coffee that was better than hospital coffee, but not by much. He looked older, not in a way that made me feel satisfied, just older. He said, "I did not think you would find out." And then he said, "I do not know if that makes it worse or better." I said, "It makes it what it is." He said, "I am going to pay back what I owe, every cent. It will take years, but I will do it." I said, "I know you will." He looked at me across the table. He said, "Are we going to be all right?" I thought about that for a moment, about what all right means after something like this, whether it means returning to what was before or something else. Something smaller and more honest and built on ground that has actually been tested. I said, "I think we are going to find out." He nodded. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup the way he has done since he was a kid. The same gesture. My boy, 38 years old and still doing that with his hands. Eleanor used to say he was made from the same cloth as me, and I never knew whether she meant it as a compliment. I drove home in the late afternoon light. The ice storm Harold had predicted had never come, and February had turned out mild, a false spring that would not last. The garden showed the first suggestion of new growth at the base of the rose bushes. Not blooms yet, just the quiet beginning of the year, turning over. I went into the workshop. I had been building a bookshelf, one of those projects you start in November and return to slowly through the winter. I sanded the edge of a board for a while. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil was the same smell it had always been. Eleanor used to come to the doorway sometimes and watch me work. She never said much. She just watched, the way people watch something that makes them feel settled. I thought about what I had learned that week at St. Joseph's, not what Marcus had done, which I understood, but what I had learned. That love does not make you immune to betrayal. That seeing clearly is not the same as being cold. That you can love someone and still refuse to be diminished by them. And that refusing is not a failure of love, but a condition of it. I do not know if Marcus and I will rebuild everything we had. I think we will build something, because he is still my son and I am still his father, and that means something, even when it does not mean everything. Eleanor's roses will bloom in April. The workshop will be here. The house on Maple Grove, paid for and mine, will still stand on the same ground it has stood on since 1988. My name is Robert Callahan. I am 67 years old. I loved my son without conditions for 38 years, and I learned this year that conditions are not the opposite of love. Sometimes they are the proof of it. If you have someone in your life who is asking you to look away from what you know, do not look away. Truth is not an enemy of love. It is the only foundation love can actually stand on. If this story reached something in you, I would be grateful to hear what it brought up. Leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from tonight. Thank you for being here with me. I mean that more than you know.